You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Sam Fazeli, and my co-hosts today are Eric Schmidt, Brian Skorney, and Matt Gline. Special guest Matt Gline. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. So, we're going to start the conversation today with the discussion about HIV funding, etc. So, we heard the US Department of Health and Human Services, the HHS, was weighing plans to cut federal government funding for domestic HIV funding. Now, a lot of the ex-US funding has with USAID has been already impacted across the board, but here is now coming home. So that would be quite interesting if this is true. And share prices of a couple of companies that are involved in the HIV space did get hit. And so, Brian, do you mind walking us through what your take on this is and how you think about the whole story and whether it's warranted that some share prices weakened on it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam. So, yeah, I mean, it's the new administration. Obviously, there's a big X factor across many things, and what I hear from investors across the board is just the uncertainty of the introduction of the new Trump administration, RFK Jr., Secretary of HHS. Just that there's a lot of questions as to what direction is the administration going to take in numerous things. I think there's some things that people are clearly concerned about, but like the vaccine side of the story, others that are people are just questioning. But one of the things that I found really interesting, and I cover Gilead every time I've kind of seen them in the last few months post Trump's win, I kind of broached the question to them of what are they hearing from the administration in terms of HIV funding, and in particular HIV prevention funding. And this is really important because Gilead has had an enormous move over the last year, and I would say that's very much largely due to enthusiasm around their twice yearly prevention lenacapavir. The data from their phase 3 studies have looked really good, effectively superior to the PrEP options that are out there right now, Truvada or Descovy. And really, one of the major reasons, not only is it a very effective drug at prevention, but it's really sort of a forced compliance of 2 injections per year versus taking the drug on a daily basis, as in the case of Descovy. And we've really seen that across the studies where if patients are non-compliant and they're high-risk patients, you see a breakthrough of patients getting HIV. So the very, very high efficacy that we've seen with twice annual lenacapavir, the convenience of just going in and getting a quick injection once every 6 months. There's a lot of enthusiasm that this is going to be a really big launch. If you look at consensus right now, just in 2030, consensus has lenacapavir PrEP at about $4 billion and growing very substantially after that versus about $2 billion that they currently do for Descovy PrEP. So this is really kind of the big growth driver for Gilead. But the question winds up being, right, how committed is this administration to sort of HIV prevention? Obviously, there's a lot of questions around how the CDC is going to issue recommendations or change recommendations. Obviously, vaccines have a lot of controversy as to what the CDC is going to do and how significant the recommendations that they have right now will be maintained. But there's commentary historically from RFK Jr. that isn't exactly super pro HIV prevention. So one has to wonder, will they have the same level of commitment? So look, I think the Wall Street Journal report said that HHS was looking to substantially cut HIV and other prevention efforts right now. Right now, the CDC spends about $1.3 billion on HIV prevention each year. But on top of that is sort of the policies that drive much more substantial amount of funding, not just in terms of Medicaid and Medicare, but also the guidelines and recommendations that have downstream effects on payers too. That came out Tuesday night. Wednesday, there were already people from the Trump administration sort of walking that back. But I think it sort of opened up the people's eyes to the idea of, here is somewhere where the Trump administration can have an impact, and we really have to have a clear understanding of what that impact, if any, is going to be. With all the efforts Doge has had, with all the efforts that RFK Jr. has had, and, I understand Weldon is no longer being positioned for director of CDC, but there were a lot of concerns that some of the public things that he said across the board would be very concerning for future funding and future recommendations of programs such as this. And that's why I think Gilead took a little bit of a hit. It has been trading down basically since that Tuesday announcement.
Yeah, I mean, it was the surprise, well, to some people anyway, great stock of in the biotech space, having been a laggard in terms of performance for some years, I would say. So it's a pity that policy gets in the way of what is clearly good for patients. And now on that same front, the advisory committee for on immunization practices, ACIP, wasn't a meeting that was expected on the 26th and 28th to 28th of February, which is the one at which they would have discussed flu vaccines and etc. And that was cancelled. And also, I don't know if you want to call this a walk back, but it's back on the agenda. We just had the announcement that it's going to be on the 15th and 16th of April. And of course, there is no agenda yet, but it seems like the topics that they're going to be talking about are the same as the ones that was previously scheduled. So these include the discussion on flu vaccines and the effectiveness of the vaccine program this year or last year, a discussion on RSV drug, clesrovimab, which is a potential competitor to nirsevimab. This one is from Merck, and the other one is from Sanofi AstraZeneca. And then, of course, you've got a conversation on respiratory syncytial virus vaccines, RSV vaccines, Moderna and GSK. They're both looking for approval of 18 to discuss the data for the 18 to 59-year-olds. I mean, we don't believe that it's likely that ACIP will change its view and vote in favor of expanding to this group. There's really no need for them, is the view that I think a lot of people hold. So they've already reduced use in under 70s, and they talk about clarified use, not necessarily wanting it to be reduced, but that's what they've done. And there's going to be a discussion of the new Moderna COVID shot. And of course, an interesting discussion on CMV that would be quite, cytomegalovirus, that'd be quite good to have to see what the ACIP thinks of cytomegalovirus in general, because Moderna does have a vaccine that we're all waiting for the data for phase 3 trial in a CMV vaccine. So the conversation at ACIP may help us bracket where the expectations should be from perhaps a commercial angle or at least clinical data expectations, etc. there. So that's all we had on policy. Unless anybody, Matt or Eric, if you wanted to jump in or add anything to what we just said, or Brian, any other topics that I've missed on that front?
Well, Sam, I mean, thank God we only have one topic on policy. This is just a wonderful turn of events in the last, 6 to 8 weeks here.
I
Here, here.
did think about adding a whole bunch, but because you can, right? It's not but then it just gets a bit depressing and you don't really want to keep doing that. So, right. So we're going to go to data. And of course, Matt is here. So we're going to have to talk about the data for batoclimab. Have I pronounced that correctly? Bato is the easiest way to put it on. So, Matt, why don't you just walk us through the conversation, the announcement, the data, and your decision to clearly move to the next product, and how you want to think about setting this up as a commercial success at some point in the future, hopefully, against what you could call a well-entrenched Vyvgart, at least by then anyway. So, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Can you hear me okay? Just making sure.
Yeah,
Great.
loud and clear.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Actually, confession for the field, which is I was invited to do this before anyone else knew that
Correct.
the Immunovant data was coming out, and to be sort of a general commentator. And I was like, this seems like a convenient week because I obviously knew it was coming. So I'll answer all those questions. Actually, I had just like one inside baseball sort of anecdote that I thought was interesting before I actually talk about the Immunovant data, which is actually just about like biotech public equity market structure, which is, so we announced this data on Wednesday morning. And the thing that companies do when they announce data that the market cares about is you email all your investors and you go out, and then you wind up filling your day with meetings. And it's kind of a fun day in the sense that, like, you get to tell your story, you get to get a lot of feedback. I learn a lot in these meetings. Investors have thoughts on what we should do and what the competitors are saying and what the chatter is, and it's like a really busy day. So we did 25 meetings on Wednesday, and one of the things that I think is interesting. So Immunovant is a very heavily shorted stock. This was a very controversial data release. 20% of the float was short, probably one of the more shorted stocks in the index. And the sort of general consensus on this stuff is that a lot of those shorts are sort of what I call pod funds, which are these, like, for those that aren't sort of close to it, these groups of investors who work as sort of a unit at an enterprise like Citadel or Millennium. And they're on a short leash and they run what's called market neutral. So they're short about as much as they're long. They're betting against as many stocks as they're betting on. And pod funds get a lot of reputation in the current market for being the sort of prime movers of stock up and down against a backdrop of market volatility. So anyway, we did 25 of these meetings, as I said, on Wednesday. And I'm curious, I know we've got Eric and Brian on, like, what percentage of those 25 meetings, right? Immunovant, very heavily shorted stock, pods certainly heavily involved with it. What percentage of those 25 meetings would you guess were pods?
Certainly more than 50, if you agreed to take more than 50% of them.
Oh, I would go lower. I was going to say 25%.
So I'll tell you the number. The number is 0. 0 pods took a meeting, which I thought was really interesting. It's not like we turned them down. Basically, 0 pods asked for a meeting. And the reason I believe that 0 pods asked for a meeting is they didn't care what I had to say about the data, right? They were positioned short in many cases. It was a short that fit with their overall strategy. And I don't begrudge anyone this, like, this is their business model. But it was just this super interesting moment for me of, like, yeah, they're not looking for my opinion on whether this data is good or bad. They have a position, they have a setup as a fund, and they were going to run with that position. And the market didn't blow up their short. And so they sort of continue to operate. And this was an interesting experience for me because you want, ideally, like, equity research analysts who took our calls. We got ones who love the data, we got ones who push back on the data. Like, you have a discussion with all sides, but most of the funds who took the calls were pretty positively inclined on Immunovant, whether they held the stock or not, and we're sort of giving constructive feedback. And the whole side of the market that was betting against us just sort of skipped it. And it's interesting as a company because it makes it very hard to sort of position and figure out what to do. You don't get that feedback. You don't sort of understand what's going on. And frankly, you feel a little bit like whatever, like the object of a prop bet at the Super Bowl, where what you're doing is a little bit beside the point for the business of the people trading the stock. And it was just like an interesting reflection on the day that we put the data out.
This is fascinating to me, Matt. I mean, you're right that it speaks to the market structure that we have right now, and maybe whether it's broken or not, which is a topic that we've been discussing a lot at Cantor. I also wonder if, because the event has happened and you were speaking to folks after the data came out, whether, you know, they've just played you, as you say, for this event, and whether they were short or long, the event's now over and they're on to the next event. We often find that there's this, you know, short-termism in the marketplace where all a pod shop investor cares about is the next milestone, and whether they made or lost money on Immunovant this week, perhaps they're on to the next.
Yeah, totally possible. Totally possible. It was not at all like I expected that morning. I was like, okay, I'm gearing up for battle. We're on the ground, shields and swords and whatever, and like we're gonna have the conversation. And then the starkness of, like, literally zero of our detractors speaking to me was an interesting moment. Anyway, unless anyone has anything else to say on that, I'll skip to the data now. But I just thought that was like an interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
But
maybe
that's a pretty good let's call it anecdote, but it is pretty good because it's nice and fresh.
Yeah. So on the data itself, so like the setup here, which again some people may be familiar with, some aren't, is there's this very promising, successful class of drugs called anti-FcRn antibodies. They work by affecting the rate at which the body recycles a particular category of antibodies called IgG antibodies. And if you inhibit the IgG binding domain of what's called the neonatal Fc receptor, you lower the overall level of of IgG antibodies in the body, which could, in theory, make you more prone to illness and things. In practice, we've seen very little of that, down to quite deep levels of suppression of IgG. But what it does do is there are a bunch of diseases that are autoimmune diseases where the body produces IgG autoantibodies to some form of self. If those antibodies are to the neuromuscular junction, it's called myasthenia gravis, and it has neuromuscular symptoms. If they're to the thyroid, it causes Graves' disease and thyroid-related symptoms, and ultimately thyroid eye disease, and so on. The undisputed leader in this field right now is a company called argenx that has a $40 billion market cap or something, and a very successful drug called efgartigimod that has launched in both myasthenia gravis and in CIDP. And so we have a next generation anti-FcRn antibody. We actually have a couple of them, which is relevant for this discussion. But they're both what I would call next generation in that they achieve a couple of things that efgartigimod doesn't. One is sort of boring, which is important to patients, but they're formulatable in a well-concentrated, relatively low-dose subcutaneous injection. So a very normal shot of I think it's literally maybe the same device as Cosentyx, for example. And then the other thing that they both do is they both suppress IgG more deeply in our studies generally than we see with efgartigimod. Efgartigimod usually suppresses IgG in kind of the mid-60s. Every now and then you have a study that's a little higher, a little lower, but kind of the mid-60s% range. And our antibodies suppress IgG in the high 70s. Every now and then you have a study that's a little bit lower, a little bit higher. And so this was a study that we ran on our first generation anti-FcRn antibody. It's called batoclimab, which was developed by Hanol, a South Korean company, and is a really interesting drug, except it has one not so small issue, which is that in addition to interrupting IgG binding to FcRn, it interrupts albumin binding to FcRn, and so it reduces blood albumin levels. And on my 5th day as CEO of Roivant, we found out that one unexpected consequence of that is it significantly elevates LDL. So we got to work on a phase 3 program anyway, which is the study that just read out this week. But we also got to work developing a next generation drug called IMVT-1402, which is designed to have all of the same properties as batoclimab, except for that interference of albumin. And actually, I think it was on Biotech Hangout we talked about a year and a half ago about the fact that we had achieved those goals, that IMVT-1402 does the same things as batoclimab except for the albumin. Now, that said, we were still running this study in myasthenia gravis with batoclimab, and that study read out this week. And there are a lot of interesting directions we could take this conversation, but we were very happy with the data from the study in that it showed two things that we really cared about. One is that it showed quite a deep dose response. That is, the lower dose of batoclimab, which is similar to efgartigimod in its IgG suppression, produced clinical data that looked, at the face of it, pretty similar to the data shown by efgartigimod, a 4.6 point reduction in MG-ADL from baseline. And then the high dose, 680 milligrams of batoclimab, showed a 5.6 point, or sorry, it was 4.7 on the low dose, 5.6 point reduction in MG-ADL, which is the largest absolute reduction in MG-ADL ever shown in a big late stage study in MG. So a very impressive number. Now, the other contentious, interesting talking point around this data is our placebo response rate was a 3.6 point improvement in MG-ADL. And when efgartigimod had run their studies, they showed I think a 1.7 point improvement in MG-ADL on placebo, so a much lower placebo response rate. And as a consequence, our placebo-adjusted deltas were smaller than theirs, even though the absolute magnitude of benefit in our high dose was larger. And I think that's a complicated setup, to be honest, because I think one of the earliest lessons you learn in biotech is you can't look at drug effects alone. You have to look at placebo as well. And in this case, they point in pretty different directions in terms of the quality of the drug. And so that's been a sort of interesting controversy. So I'll pause there and see. I can go a couple different directions with this, but just any questions or comments at this point? I don't want to give an uninterrupted monologue.
You were doing quite well there, Matt.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily. Eric, did you have a question?
No, loud and clear. Keep going.
Okay. Sorry. So what? Oops, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, that's better.
Sorry. What question is, okay, so what do we do from here, basically? So one of the questions we wanted to answer was, does deeper IgG suppression improve clinical benefit? We've shown this in a number of other studies, including in Graves' disease and some other places that we're really excited about. No one had ever really shown it to this level in myasthenia gravis. So that felt good to us, and it sets us up, we think, well for IMVT-1402 in myasthenia gravis. But we faced all along this sort of nagging decision about what to do with batoclimab. This is a registrational study. We could file with FDA and we think get approved on it. But it's got this fact that it drives up LDL cholesterol and lowers albumin. And even though it produces an impressive absolute clinical benefit, it is both hampered by its placebo-adjusted delta and, more importantly, hampered by this lab abnormality that it creates. And so we had decided and said publicly a long time ago that it was unlikely we were going to launch batoclimab because, as Sam started with, efgartigimod Vyvgart is such a great approved product, it was going to be hard to compete. And so we are focusing on the next generation drug, IMVT-1402, which is now going to be in 6 studies imminently, most of which pivotal or registrational. In the announced indications are MG, CIDP, Graves, and difficult to treat fourth line RA, and then 2 others that we're going to announce in the future. And our view is, look, in indications like MG and CIDP, where argenx is clearly ahead of us, we're going to fight based on the properties of our drug to take share. And we've also put out some CIDP data this week that looks fantastic. It's earlier and a little bit more complicated data, so it's hard to know for sure. But if that pans out, I think we have a huge commercial opportunity in CIDP. In MG, look, we're going to fight for it, but we're coming from behind, and I think it'll be tough to unseat the king, as it were. But in every other indication, we can be first in class or close to first in class. We'll be running our studies at the same time as they are, so we won't be hampered by differences in time. We can talk more about why the placebos were different, but I think a big piece of it is they ran their studies before patients knew that FcRns worked, and we ran our studies after patients knew that FcRns worked. And so there was a lot of expectation bias embedded in the placebo response rate, which we won't have in these other indications. And I think that opens us up to be a class leader in every indication but 2, right? In MG and CIDP, we may be behind, but the biology of FcRn is very broad. There's literally probably 24 indications or more that are currently being studied. And I think in all but those 2, we should be expected, in my opinion, to produce competitive or better than competitive data and a really attractive profile. And so you asked originally about the question of commercial competition. I think that's really the reason why we're focusing on 1402.
Matt, since you didn't get the pushback on your data that you were hoping to, no one was willing to engage with you and debate the results. Maybe just a question for me is, I don't cover your stock, but one thing we always hear from investors is just how crowded the IgG lowering space is, whether it's degraders or agents like your own. It seems like they're a dime a dozen these days. Can you want to address that?
Yeah, I guess so there are a lot of different people looking at this biology now. argenx obviously paved the way and showed what you can do commercially. And myasthenia gravis is one of these great orphan indications with a lot of unmet need, where I think the market size has so far meaningfully surpassed sort of antecedent expectations, and so it's attracted a lot of attention. And therefore, whatever, imitation is the finest form of flattery, and in biotech, the scariest form of competition. A lot of people are trying to do the thing now. Look, I think actually 2 things that I think are interesting about that comment, which I've tried to get away from. One is the FcRn space literally is not that crowded. There are maybe 4 real late-stage FcRns, ours, UCBs, J&Js, and argenx's. And J&J and UCB have good programs, but like slightly more complicated profiles in different ways. argenx is the leader, and I believe we should be sort of number 2 or number 1, depending on where and when. But unlike, say, CD19 bispecific T-cell engagers, where it feels like there are 150 of these in development, mostly unlicensed by either big pharma or smaller companies from China. You just saw yesterday, I think, Sanofi announced a CD20 bispecific deal. Unlike that area, which is related, right, similar biology, the FcRn category itself doesn't have as many imitators. There's like Viridian and a couple of others kind of coming, but not that many. And I think part of that's because, bluntly, FcRn is a difficult target to drug. You have to avoid albumin. You have to think about pH and other things. And so it's just been harder to create these antibodies. So that's sort of narrowly within the class. On B-cell depletion, IgG sort of immune reset, autoantibody work generally, my view is it's pretty myopic to call it crowded when you compare it with RA or UC or even like HS, where it feels like there's 15 different mechanisms in development in HS on the inflammatory side. inflammatory disease is a much more advanced commercial landscape. We've been working in anti-inflammatory mechanisms since forever, but certainly since Humira. And so I think the IgG B cell landscape is much newer, but I think it's a really big tent, and people forget that sometimes. And so they focus on what does it mean to slice up the pie of MG or the MG plus CIDP pie, which look big, but maybe not as big overall as it could. But they forget that there's 330,000 prevalent Graves patients who have failed all available therapeutic options other than surgical removal of their thyroid. There are tens and tens of thousands of patients with myositis. There are tens and tens of thousands of patients with, there's a bunch of cardiac indications that are not even yet being pursued. There's pemphigus and BP, which argenx has done some work on. There's so much biology under the tent that, yeah, there will be multiple mechanisms approved, but we are in Humira's second year of launch in the analogy to, or maybe in Enbrel's second year of launch, in the analogy to inflammatory disease. And I guess what I think is the size of the market and the number of available indications is so far expanding much faster than the number of competitive classes.
That's great, Matt. Thanks very much for a very
Sure.
good, passionate detail, I would say. No less than every other time. So that's great and an interesting update. Now, in the interest of time, I think we do have some other data points we need to move on to. I'm going
Sure.
to pass it on to Eric to talk about the INSEE data for vorsitinib, and the share price was the headline was positive and the share price was telling you something else. So I'm interested in your take on that, and then we'll move on to pretty much talking about exon skippers and siRNA and etc. Related to DMD to start with. Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I mean, this is the povorcitinib data that you're referencing. It's a JAK1 inhibitor for hidradenitis suppurativa. That's HS, as Matt Gline was just speaking to. It's a dermatology indication that is very large. We think this is probably a $10 billion market. It's still quite young in terms of its market penetration. We only got the first couple of drugs approved for hidradenitis suppurativa 4 or 5 years ago, and those were the TNF inhibitors. More recently, we've had some IL-17s that were approved, and now we're heading into brand new classes of agents, and there are many in development coming behind povorcitinib, many of which feature different mechanisms. But the povo data kind of designed to be maybe a third-line therapy here after TNFs and IL-17s. As you mentioned, Sam, the data were pretty good. I wouldn't say they were great, but there were 2 different trials and 2 different arms of povorcitinib in each study, and there was a consistently higher drug effect over placebo in all cases with stat significance. So I think it's very, very, very likely that povorcitinib is going to be approved, and yet, as Sam mentioned, the stock was down. Why was that? Well, the data were just so-so on povo. They weren't particularly strong, and I think there are a lot of questions now with the competition, and in particular with another JAK1 inhibitor coming, AbbVie's Rinvoq, which will read out in the first part of next year, whether there isn't a fairly wide open opportunity for Rinvoq to do about as well as povo. Insight had been suggesting that povo could be dosed to a higher level of JAK1 inhibition, and that might result in a higher level of efficacy. And the povo data kind of line up with the IL-17s, but they're not particularly stronger, maybe on the margins, somewhat weaker than UCB's Bimzelx. So what we're left with is AbbVie having the next shot on goal, and if AbbVie is going to be successful with Rinvoq, that drug already has a brand name. Of course, it would have AbbVie's resources behind it, and I think investors are just kind of scratching their head right now and trying to figure out if in this third line setting, which may be worth $1 billion or $2 billion in peak revenue potential, whether it's going to be Insight's game or whether Rinvoq won't come in and steal their thunder here. Meanwhile, this is a company that's got a lot of question marks around it, and povo had been thought of as potentially the most interesting drug in their pipeline as we head toward the eventual patent loss exclusivity on Jakafi, their $3 billion blockbuster. So with the povo news behind it, maybe again, as Matt was referencing, it's kind of open season for the shorts, and people have come back to this name and don't see now the pipeline as being capable of maybe providing growth through that patent cliff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is also the think, as you said already, thinking that AbbVie has proven its mettle in this in the general space, with Humira and then Rinvoq and Skyrizi in the general overall space. That it just might have the advantage of being AbbVie, right? So. And now, Eric, I think we can move on to DMD now. You wanted to just touch on the RNA Dyne data set, and then we'd move on to Brian to talk through the general comments from the Muscular Dystrophy Association conference.
Yeah, unfortunately, Brian's going to have to address, the sad news in this muscular dystrophy space, which came from, of course, the Sarepta patient death that we had. I guess I get the glass half full view and get to talk about a new set of agents that are really starting to, I guess, provide a different benchmark for what exon skippers are capable of doing. I'm specifically talking about Avidity's drug Delzota, which is being developed for a subset of DMD patients who have exon 44 amenable mutations, and Dyne's drug DYN-251, which would be appropriate for patients with exon 51 mutations. In total, there's probably no more than 2,000 to 3,000 patients who might be amenable to these two exon skippers. We're probably talking less than 20%, maybe 10 to 15% of the total DMD marketplace. But these drugs seemingly are doing what hasn't been possible before, which is they're showing the ability to create quite a bit of exon skipping, and in some cases creating full-length dystrophin up in the 10 to even as high as 25% range. Just to put that into context, the first generation exon skippers were potentially producing full-length dystrophin closer to 1, 2, 3%. So we've got a sea change going on here, and I think the sea change is best evidenced by the fact that in Avidity studies, you are seeing CK levels, CK being a marker of muscle decline and dysfunction. You're seeing CK levels go down to essentially normal levels in these patients. This is something we have never, ever seen before. In fact, there's been a lot of debate in the DMD community around CK as a biomarker and whether it's even a good biomarker of muscle damage, because nobody has been able to hit it very hard, and certainly nobody has been able to hit it consistently in all patients, like the Avidity data are showing. So this dramatic reduction toward near normalization of CK levels, that is something that I am very excited about. I'm curious, of course, to hear Brian's views on this. But to me, for the first time, I'm very optimistic that if you're truly reducing these markers of muscle damage, you're going to truly benefit patients in terms of functional outcomes. We haven't yet seen that from Dyne and Avidity, but those data are coming. Avidity will show us a meaningful functional update toward the end of the year, and I'm optimistic that it's going to be better than anything else we've seen. Meanwhile, both of these companies are marching toward BLA approval, BLA filings. I think Avidity is expected to file at the back half of this year, and then Dyne some point in the early half of next year. But let me turn it over to Brian for his thoughts. I know he's very, very close to the space.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? We've seen sort of first generation PMOs where the initial drugs approved on very low expression, controversial approvals. And, the game here has really been to try to get more and more dystrophin expression. I think if you talk to any parents of any of these kids, they'll say that's just a very meaningful thing to them to see more expression. It's believed to be better, I think, given the biology of the disease. That is sort of a pretty obvious statement to make. Ideally, you want to normalize it, but there's a lot of data historically showing that if you're above 10% dystrophin compared to a normal person, you're really phenotypically much different than a DMD patient, and more like a Becker dystrophy, Becker muscular dystrophy phenotype. So I think that like 10% threshold is something that's very meaningful. And even if you go back to the controversial approval of eteplirsen, even the FDA reviewers who were against the approval of eteplirsen they sort of leaned on this 10% to say, well, if it was above 10%, there's just much more precedent to say that this is a meaningful threshold versus sort of the 1% that you would see with the eteplirsen. So I think it's great. We're getting more muscle targeted distribution. We're getting drugs that hang out a little longer than PMO, which very quickly gets peed out of the system. So I think we see this move back and forth between sort of the chronic exon skipping based therapy, which has to be taken in small subgroups at a time. Exon 51 amenable patients only make up 13% of DMD, and that's the largest subgroup. You get into increasingly small subgroups, so these drugs need to be designed again and again to go into increasingly small patient populations, particularly given the controversy around some of the gene therapy. It's nice to see continued evolution here. Obviously, Sarepta has been very successful commercializing Exondys 51 and their two other exon skipping therapies. One of the questions we still have is we've never seen randomized clinical studies succeed really for any of these disease modifying therapies here. And I think that's a big question mark and, a bit of a headwind to this entire group of dystrophin replacement therapies. And, I'll kind of use that to segue into, MDA is usually a very good conference in terms of a lot of new clinical presentations, scientific presentations that I think provide a lot of hope and a lot of optimism and encouragement to patients and caregivers with this disease. So it's really unfortunate to have the event somewhat marred by this event that came to light this week. So news broke of a Dear Doctor letter that Sarepta issued following the unfortunate death of a patient treated with their gene therapy, Elevidys, the proximal cause being liver failure. So this drug was approved under controversial circumstances. On this specific case, and I would like to use this to kind of re-engage in conversation about how to think about regulatory approvals. But in this case, the use of high-dose systemic AAV-based gene therapy has seen liver tox across serotypes, diseases, and we know there have been deaths in other programs, even commercially, like Zolgensma, which on label has deaths due to hepatic failure. So it really does seem like controlling for liver inflammation and liver damage is one of the most consistent safety issues for this systemic gene therapy space. Each company has different protocols in place to try and minimize immune-mediated reactions that can cause liver tox. All of them prophylactically use high doses of corticosteroids prior to treatment and sort of taper down a month or two after treatment. A number of them may use other immunosuppressants as well. I know eculizumab is either used prophylactically or on hand in many cases, but clearly it isn't enough at least in the protocol that they're using here in this case to completely mitigate liver failure. This case is also complicated by what sounds like reactivation of a latent CMV infection, as apparently post-treatment, this person saw increases in CMV-specific IgE. Outside of just the tragedy of this event, and it's very sad to see a patient loss due to a drug administration. But Sarepta shares were down 25% since the event was made public. And I think this is really the case, not so much because a liver-related death is so completely unexpected, but it's now, it really cements as something real where the efficacy of this gene therapy is controversial. So it raises the question of the risk-benefit balance here. So to just recall for everyone, it failed a randomized placebo-controlled phase 2 study that was meant to be used for initial approval, but wound up still being used to obtain accelerated approval following an AdCom where the review division was critical of the application, but the advisory committee members voted in favor of approval. A phase 3 study then also failed to achieve the primary endpoint, but an application for full approval was accepted, and Elevidys was granted full approval in ambulatory patients and accelerated approval in non-ambulatory patients. When that approval came out, FDA issued some internal documents as well, reflecting that the head of CBER, Peter Marks, essentially made the decision over the objections of a good portion of the review team. So I think that the aftermath of this patient death and what I've heard in client conversations over this week is it really raises the question that I think has to be consistently litigated in the space, and that is, how do you effectively balance risks and benefits for regulatory approvals? And there's sort of this dichotomy among the population where, people really want access to potentially beneficial therapeutics faster. I mean, that's why we have things like Right to Try. That's why we have a lot of advocacy groups pushing for faster development, cutting through red tape quicker. But we also don't want drugs that wind up having a net harm. And this is just the type of situation where in the aftermath of this, people struggle with, okay, did the FDA do the right thing? Does the FDA now have to act to do something to reverse course? Was it still the right decision because it's 1 in 800 patients where there's a liver-related death? But if this drug is really beneficial, then certainly for DMD that may be an acceptable safety for patients and their caregivers. So I think that's really the big question that gets brought up once again here when we have a controversial approval, a safety event, a death, unfortunately. How do we really view the U.S. FDA's role in providing gatekeeper, and what's too much of an unacceptable risk, what's too little acceptable data for approval? And this is something that I think I've been discussing for over a decade and in my research, and it's just an area that is just always under constant evolution and relitigation.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. Really, really good as usual. Matt, Eric, did you want to add anything? Obviously, a very sad situation here, and I have to say, Brian, I agree with you in the general commentary about this. Is if you had been through a normal regulatory process, which I would say this has not, then it would have been a different conversation. But did you guys want to add anything before we move on to the last bit of data?
Well, I mean, I just maybe have a question for Brian. It's one that we've been struggling with a lot here, which is whether microdystrophin is really something that matters to patients. So we've seen good microdystrophin expression, as you noted, Brian, with both the Sarepta and Pfizer gene therapies. Neither has really amounted to much functionally. The Pfizer drug missed all of its endpoints despite extremely good microdystrophin expression. And yet now with these exon skippers that produce more of a full-length molecule, we're starting to see, I think, something very different biologically. So to me, at least, I think the FDA may have gotten it completely wrong in approving drugs based solely on the ability to provide for microdystrophin expression. But curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess I would say I don't know pretty much across the board. And we were talking about sort of the PMOs and the next generation exon skippers. Again, it's never really been truly determined in randomized placebo-controlled studies, right? We don't know what level of dystrophin, whether it be, just the exon skip dystrophin, which is, like 98% of full-length dystrophin versus these engineered microdystrophins. And, maybe some of them have better efficacy than others. And maybe there's a different threshold. Maybe 80% of microdystrophin would be equivalent to 10% of exon skip dystrophin. I think, we're sort of all operating in Plato's cave to some extent. Like we're looking at shadows and we're just not quite sure. What I have really criticized all of these companies on again and again and again and again. And I totally understand the counter argument. It goes back to what I was saying, like, the patients, caregivers, physicians, they really want things quickly. This is a disease that is horrifically progressive, but it is not that quickly progressive, right? It's sort of similar in my mind to like Alzheimer's to a certain extent. It's more progressive than Alzheimer's, but a 1-year study, there is so much heterogeneity in how a patient is going to look, right? Because, you have the simultaneous counterbalancing of patients are growing, patients' muscle function is growing along with them, but you also have this damaging disease. And if you look at patient level data, and I mean, I remember kind of freaking out about this going into the eteplirsen drisapersen approvals 10 years ago, or reviews 10 years ago. PTC had this great slide of their study where they had all the patient level data, and you would see patients who were like improving, 100% on 6-minute walk. You'd see other patients going down 100% on 6-minute walk. And these are placebo patients, right? So I think the problem to me is, I just honestly, I don't even think a 1-year study is really going to prove it out. Because if you have a patient who, trips and sprains their ankle, all of these measures are going to look terrible for that patient. That doesn't mean that the drug isn't working, but if they're on the drug arm, that's going to really kill 6-minute walk, NSAA, time to rise. And if one of the placebo patients happens to go through a growth spurt, all of these measures are going to improve for them, right? So I think it's really, you need a lot more patients and a longer follow-up. I do think we'll get a lot more data when Sarepta's study of their exon 45 and exon 53 drugs read out. That study's sort of taken forever, but I think next year we'll finally see a 2-year study and about 200 patients, and I think that will be really informative. But I think, to me, we just don't really know, outside of what's decent bioplausibility from preclinical models, that any of these things could work. We just really don't know that it does work as hypothesized in clinical studies yet.
Right. Thanks a lot, Brian. Again, as usual, very well discussed and argued. So really appreciate that. I'm just going to mention the last bit of data, which of course is quite interesting because it's from Alnylam. And if you remember last year, some folks, I don't know if anybody in here thought the same, the Alnylam ATTR data was going to be the thing that was going to save, was it last year or the year before? I can't remember now. It's all merging into one. Save the biotech sector. That was going to be the key driver. The data came, lots of people questions, etc. So of course that drug is now approved, Amvuttra, in the second setting, which is the cardiomyopathy indication. It's a subcutaneously dosed quarterly, which is a pretty good setup for the drug. It's a silencer, which may have an advantage over, and Eric's going to comment too, the other drugs, acoramidis and tafamidis, but which are stabilizers. And the label they got was pretty nice and broad, and I think that is why the stock is reacting, I would say, and it covers across the board in terms of the possible indications that you could get for this. So, and the thought process is that this is at least from consensus data that we have in the terminal, possibly a $5 billion product by 2030, or more or less. But I'd love to hear from Eric also with regards to, I know that Eric's colleague has been a fan of Bridge Bio and acoramidis. That's
Dr.
Josh,
Schimmer, of course, yeah.
Yes, who's one of our friends and regular presenters here. So, Eric, did you want to touch on this? Anything to add? Share price is telling us a good story, but then
Well,
we know share prices are not always
he may be your friend, Sam, but he's just my colleague.
Oh, okay.
No, I think maybe the most surprising thing today is that Alnylam is up 10%. I mean, this is a drug that you as you previewed last year, we got the phase 3 data. They were very strong. The stock went up. Nobody expected the drug would not get approved. There was a little bit of debate around the margin on whether they would get, the full label language that they really needed, which was about some kind of, survival benefit on the label. Both acoramidis and tafamidis from Bridge Bio and Pfizer respectively do have such labels. So they needed to hold serve and get something similar, and they did. And the label's generally very good. But honestly, I think what we're seeing today, and what we've really been seeing over the last couple of weeks in biotech, is a flight to safety. Any larger, stable, earnings-driven organization, which Alnylam certainly is, has seen an influx of funding, and conversely, unfortunately, almost any mid-cap, slightly higher risk, non-earnings-driven name has seen an exodus of funding. So my guess is that that's the dynamic here that's happening today. But this ATTR marketplace is an interesting one. First of all, it's enormous. It's rapidly growing, and certainly there's room for many, many players. And you're right, my colleague and friend Josh Schimmer has been a big fan of acoramidis and the launch they're having with Bridge Bio's support. That drug was approved late last year and had a very good initial month and a half or so of sales data in 2024. And we think that despite the pending competition between acoramidis and vutrisiran from Alnylam, that the two are probably going to coexist quite well. Expectations still on Wall Street for vutrisiran, mostly because it's a different mechanism, are very, very high relative to the forecasted sales of acoramidis. And we think it'll probably be a little bit more of an equal game between these two for market share, which relative to expectations would seemingly benefit the Bridge Bio side of the equation. But Alnylam's got a great drug. Nobody should be raining on their parade today. And again, I think number one, first and foremost, this is a very large market that is growing at a very, very rapid pace. And I don't think there are any losers at the space.
The only thing I would add is you are all very brave for having a conversation about Alnylam and Bridge Bio on Twitter, because you will definitely get 8 million comments from people with extremely strong opinions on the back of this.
Yeah, but Matt, I've only got 2 followers, so it doesn't matter.
Send my comments over to Josh, please.
That's right.
Now, let's move on to deals. We've had an interesting flow, a couple that I'm going to highlight, and then Eric, I know you have a thought on this as well. Of course, the one's the Sanofi Dren Bio, and the other one is AstraZeneca's acquisition of a Belgian company. So I'll start very quickly with that. EsoBiotec. It's a company that Astra has acquired, paying $425 million upon deal close, and then there's $575 million in development and regulatory milestones. It's an in vivo cell therapy company, so a lentiviral in vivo, if you want to call it a CAR T. So there are new others that are playing here. The hope of all of these companies is to cut quite a lot of the burdensome aspects of CAR T therapy out of the equation. Number one, the fact that you need to go through lymphodepletion. Number two, the fact that you have to take the CAR Ts, then manufacture them however long it takes, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, depending on who says what about their product these days. And then, of course, you have to give it back with a large amount of CRS, et cetera, that you have to manage. Here, you've got something that you could truly use as an off-the-shelf product. What is remarkable here is, of course, I have tried to find out. This is a company that was in stealth mode, and I think this is something that Eric wants to touch on. What's remarkable here is that, from what I have found, this company has raised something in the region of $25 million so far. So selling with a $425 million upfront cash, that's pretty good return. And when you then look at, and I don't know how long it was in stealth mode, etc., but it doesn't really matter. It's still a pretty good return for that amount of money being invested. And it's not that different to the story of Dren Bio, where they've sold an asset, from what I understand, for $600 million upfront to Sanofi, with a $1.3 billion still to come in development and milestones, launch milestones. And the company still carries on operating independently. So this is a T-cell engager, not a T-cell engager, sorry, myeloid cell engager it aims to deplete B cells heavily. So the first one is more about a platform that Astra has acquired, adding it to its cell therapy platform that it recently acquired also through Gracell, 2 different approaches. And here we have something that's a bispecific that tries to get very deep B cell depletion. I would say not necessarily the same return here, because the company, from what I gathered, has raised something in the region of $180 million so far. So, but still $600 million up front, and it still carries on. So now, I know, Eric, you've been thinking about these valuations and what it means for biotech in generally. Did you want to just touch on that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that great intro. And I'm curious to get Matt's view on this too. I know that Roivant spends a lot of time acquiring assets and thinking about valuations. And what struck me about these 2 deals is the price tag. As you noted, Sam, the price tag is not inconsiderable, $425 million upfront in the case of EsoBiotec, and $300 million upfront for the asset in the case of Dren Bio. These are enormous valuations in the private sector relative to what these 2 companies would be trading at in the public sector, right? So they're both phase 1, they're both unproven assets. There's a good chance that neither of these companies would have a positive enterprise value right now, as bad as things are in mid-cap biotech. Yet the money that pharma is willing to shell out for private assets is at a strong disconnect to what's happening in public valuations. Maybe these deals are being negotiated for the last 3 or 4 months. Maybe pharma felt they couldn't renege on terms that have been partially agreed upon or something. But there's something very wrong, because if you were Sanofi or if you were Astra, you could have gone out and bought something similar. Not exact. I mean, the in vivo CAR Ts are for the most part private. There's still a few other companies that are also trading privately that probably would have liked this valuation. But you could buy a lot of things in the public markets for really pennies on the dollar relative to what we're seeing here. So, Matt, I don't know if you have any views on this.
Yeah, look, I have a pretty. I think that's an interesting point of view. I have a pretty different take on a theme that I've been watching for the last 18 months, which is, to me, like, look, I'm not a public markets biotech investor. To me, like, one of the biggest, most important questions for the public markets biotech universe this year and into the future is what we've seen an enormous amount of is big pharma companies doing deals like this, right? $400 to $800 million asset deals, either in earlier stage or out of China or out of smaller companies, instead of whatever, buying, if you like T cell engagers or B cell depleting therapies, buying, there's a couple of public companies, Cullinan, whatever, that have later stage programs that would have cost a multiple of what like Sanofi paid in this situation, for example, with premiums and everything. And I think the sort of value buying, as it were, which you think of it as a premium to small public deals or as a premium to what you might be able to do in other private situations, it's a huge discount to paying $6 billion for a development stage public company. And I think how that balance shakes out and what kinds of deals these guys are doing is going to be interesting. It will clearly have a weird compressing function if it turns out that pharma companies are now looking to buy earlier stage assets for hundreds of millions of dollars instead of late stage assets for billions of dollars. It's going to make the late stage assets less valuable and the early stage assets more valuable. And that's just been like something that we've been watching as an acquirer. We've been watching as we look in all different places for things, including the portfolios of big pharma themselves. So it's an interesting thing to watch overall. And I guess I was coming at it from maybe a slightly different angle than you were.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. I mean, I'll just take the, I don't know, other side of this. These are, as Eric, you said that at least in the in vivo CAR T, most of the companies are private. So if you wanted to play there, it's easier to go and negotiate a price with some of these companies than try and negotiate a share price or a price for a public company. But they're also pretty edge type investments. I mean, they are, myeloid redirecting bispecific engager for deep B cell depletion, etc. I would say that maybe the issue, the fact is that they're trying to get to bits of science or product development that are right at the front. So that if it's Astra, they've done their CAR T play with Gracell. What else they're going to do in that space apart from going into this at this stage? And now they're one of the leading companies because everybody is in the same kind of stage of development in vivo CAR T therapy. So I don't know. Does that even hold water? I just thought I'd throw that in. Now we're very close to the last minute here. One of the things I wanted to highlight is something that I noticed just today, which is AstraZeneca's investment in China, which is I think they announced a $2.5 billion investment in a research center in Beijing, research, manufacturing, AI. I mean, that's a big number. And I have to say, and there was vaccines in there too, and they were supposed to be investing something like let's say $600 million investment in the UK vaccines, which of course didn't happen because there was some disagreement with the UK government. What's interesting here is that it's Astra who's just had some issues with regards to a probe, and the details are not out there yet, but there was investigations with regards to the current and former employees, etc. And everyone thought that Astra is going to cool down on it, and they've doubled down. So that's interesting, especially in the current time where we're seeing maybe companies trying to be closer to the US than they're showing anything with China. So I thought that was quite interesting. And clearly Astra is thinking about what is good for its prospects as opposed to today's political environment. Right, a couple of minutes or a minute left. Anyone want to make any last comments? I'm looking for the unmute buttons to go off. It doesn't sound like it. So I really appreciate everybody joining. We love doing this, and we look forward to having you with us again next week, same time. So thanks very much for joining.